Ancient texts reveal that the forbidden places weren't always described with thunder or prophecy. Sometimes they were recorded the way a storehouse counts jars, or a gatehouse logs names, or a clerk marks a boundary with the dry patience of routine. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, let your breathing slow. Let the room around you recede. We will move carefully, as if we are walking through a museum after closing. When the lights are low and the cases hold their reflections like dark water, we stand at a secure archive that smells faintly of paper and mineral dust. The air is cool, regulated, and a little too still. A curator's lamp pulls light onto one object, small enough to fit in 2 hands, heavy enough to feel like a compact stone. It is a clay tablet, palm-sized, rectangular with softened corners, baked to a warm brown that shifts toward red where the surface has been rubbed by time. Along one edge, a hairline crack runs like a dried riverbed. The face is crowded with wedge marks, some crisp, some shallow, some blurred where a thumb might have once pressed too hard. The tablet is catalogued with a neat label tucked beside it, the kind of label that pretends the object is calm and fully known. A drawer number, a shelf designation, a collection name that hints at long journeys and older hands. The curator does not call it sacred. The curator calls it recorded. When we tilt our attention toward the signs, the tablet becomes less an artifact and more a witness. The wedges hold a tone that is administrative, procedural, unromantic. We can almost hear the stylus tapping, pausing, tapping again, as a scribe tried to be accurate rather than poetic. The lines are structured in a way that suggests an inventory or an instruction. We notice familiar patterns that appear in many Mesopotamian texts. The naming of people, the naming of offices, the listing of items, the marking of totals. And then we notice the anomaly. There is a phrase that does not belong to a simple count of grain or wool. There is a boundary statement. It is not framed like a moral warning. And it is not the language of myth. It has the crispness of policy. The signs suggest a prohibition, and the subject of that prohibition is not an enemy army, not a rival city, not even a disgraced official. The subject is a category that reads like ordinary people, humans in the broad sense, not the privileged few. The text indicates that a certain place is not for them, not to approach, not to cross, not to enter. We pause on that. A forbidden place can be imagined as a cave, a mountain, a star. But here the tablet pulls us toward a different kind of forbidden, a forbidden that can be staffed, a forbidden that can be enforced by routine, a forbidden that can be filed. The tablet does not shout about the Anunnaki. It does not need to. The older world often named divine authority in the same breath as procedures, as if gods and governance were interlocked. The Anunnaki, in the way later traditions speak of them, are a council of great powers. In earlier contexts, they are more like a category within the divine order, a group invoked when legitimacy is being established. We do not have to force them into the tablet. We only have to notice that the prohibition is expressed as if it carries a weight beyond one man's opinion. It reads like something that cannot be appealed, something that has been decided, and then copied into practice. The unusual detail is not only the prohibition itself, it is the way it is written. The phrasing suggests a protocol, a standard formula, a line that could be reused. It sits in the text like a stamp. That matters, because stamps do not appear for one-time events. Stamps appear when an institution expects repetition. We let our eyes move along the edges. The tablet's surface holds tiny pits and abrasions, evidence of handling, maybe by a clerk, maybe by a student learning the shapes of signs, maybe by someone verifying a shipment. On the reverse, the wedges are tighter, less generous, as if the scribe ran out of space and pressed the final instructions into the clay before it dried. The corners are rounded by wear. The tablet is not a ceremonial object. It has been used. We begin to ask the first investigative question, the kind that steadies the mind. What kind of place requires a human exclusion clause? Not an abstract realm, not a metaphor. A place that can be entered by someone else. A place that has a threshold. A place that has a reason to keep certain bodies out. In ancient Mesopotamia, thresholds are not only doors. Thresholds are categories. The threshold between clean and unclean. The threshold between temple precinct and street. The threshold between a storehouse and an open market. The threshold between a scribal chamber and a public courtyard. The threshold between a ritual installation and the ordinary labor that supports it. If a tablet marks a forbidden place, it is likely marking a managed boundary within a known landscape. Now we let the anomaly expand. We look for companions, not in this one drawer, but in the logic of archives themselves. The tablet, as a witness, suggests it is not alone. If the prohibition is formulaic, it should appear elsewhere. If the boundary mattered, it should leave traces in other documents. We imagine other pieces, broken and scattered, held in different collections, perhaps published in fragments, perhaps still untranslated. We imagine scribes in different cities, using similar phrasing because the institution trained them to do so. We imagine the sound of seals being pressed into clay, the soft thud and twist that makes authority visible. The pattern we are looking for is not a story. It is an operational habit, a habit of restricting access to a defined node within a temple economy or civic administration. A habit of declaring that certain zones are for officials, for priests, for messengers, for inspectors, for those who have been washed and designated, and not for ordinary entrance. The common story that reaches modern ears tends to treat the Anunnaki as mythic lawgivers who ban or permit humanity in sweeping, dramatic terms. The popular narrative turns the forbidden place into a cosmic secret chamber, hidden because it contains unbearable truths. It is tempting because it feels clean and complete. It tells us that the ancient world was an arena of grand beings and helpless mortals. It makes the prohibition feel like a curse. But that requires ignoring the small evidence that the ancient record often presents. It requires ignoring that many prohibitions are written the way you would write a warehouse rule. It requires ignoring that sacred space was often managed with labor schedules, ration lists, gate entries, and purity procedures. It requires ignoring that power in these cities was frequently exercised through paperwork and seals rather than spectacle. So we adopt a careful hypothesis, one that does not claim certainty. What if the forbidden place was not a distant mythic realm, but a controlled precinct? What if it was a room, a gate, a platform, a canal junction, a sealed storehouse, or an inner courtyard where certain acts had to remain uninterrupted? What if the language of divine authority was used to protect operational stability? If we read the tablet this way, the Anunnaki become less like characters in a tale and more like the invoked guarantors of a policy. Their name, or their implied authority, would serve as the highest seal. We proceed with method. We will treat the tablet as the first witness, but not the only one. We will consider how scribes mark restricted areas with determinatives that distinguish a temple from a house, a city from a field, a divine name from a human name. We will consider how gatehouses controlled movement and recorded entry. We will consider how purity language functions as a practical system of contamination control. We will consider how lists of personnel quietly reveal who was allowed near certain installations. We will consider how archaeological layers show spaces becoming more enclosed over time. Corridors narrowing, doorways reinforced, circulation redesigned. In the lamplight, the tablet's crack looks deeper, as if it is opening into the clay's interior. It reminds us that our access is also limited. We can read marks, but we cannot watch the scribe. We can infer routines, but we cannot hear the arguments that produce them. And yet the prohibition line remains. It is calm. It is firm. It is written as if it will be understood by the next person who handles the tablet, and the next, and the next. We let that settle in the mind like a quiet weight. A forbidden place is often imagined as something guarded by monsters. Here it feels guarded by a phrase, by a gatekeeper's habit, by the expectation of compliance. The forbidden place, whatever it is not protected by mystery alone. It is protected by administration. The investigation pauses here, at the glass case, with the clay cooling under our imagined fingertips. We do not need to force an answer tonight. We only need to carry one question with us, steady and unsensational, as if we are walking a corridor with a single lamp. If a rule exists that forbids humanity from entering one place, what kind of place must it have been to require a rule in the first place? The forbidden place can be approached from another angle, not as a legend, but as a coordinate. When ancient scribes wanted to locate something, they did not always draw a map. They embedded geography inside language. They used determinatives that quietly classify a thing as a city, a temple, a canal, a mountain, a field. They used direction words that behave like arrows. They used route logic that assumes the reader already knows how feet move through a familiar landscape. Tonight, we take that linguistic map seriously, because the one place begins to take shape when we treat the signs as infrastructure. We imagine a working table in a scribal room. A reed stylus rests in a shallow dish. Clay sits damp in a bowl, ready for another tablet. The scribe is trained to compress the world into wedges. A place is not only a place. A place is an entry in a system. It has classification, ownership, access rules, and sometimes an attached warning. When the text indicates that a place is forbidden to ordinary humans, the first task is to determine what kind of place the scribe thought it was. That is where determinatives matter. A city determinative signals an urban node, something with walls, gates, districts, and officials. A temple. Determinative signals a sacred institution, but also an economic machine with storehouses, workshops, rationing, and personnel hierarchies. A water determinative attached to canals or rivers signals movement and boundary together, because water routes are both roads and borders. A field determinative signals productive land, measured and taxed, not mystical. A mountain determinative signals a horizon and an outside, often connected to raw materials and distant peoples. Each determinative is a little tag that tells us what category of access might be relevant. When a forbidden place is written with a temple category, the prohibition sounds like a precinct rule. When it is written with a water category, the prohibition can sound like a control point, a restricted crossing, or a protected intake. When it is written with a city category, it could indicate an inner district, perhaps a royal or priestly core. We do not need a modern map to feel the difference. The sign itself carries the first hint. The one place also gains shape from the verbs that orbit it. A place that is entered uses one set of words. A place that is approached uses another. A place that is crossed uses still another. The record may indicate entry, access, passage, delivery, inspection, or offering. Those are not poetic verbs, they are administrative actions. If the text pairs the forbidden place with verbs of delivery, the place begins to resemble a storehouse or receiving chamber. If it pairs with verbs of purification, it begins to resemble a washing station or inner sanctum where bodies and objects must be controlled. If it pairs with verbs of assembly, it begins to resemble a council room, a restricted court, a chamber where decisions are sealed. We follow the root logic implied by place-naming conventions. Many Mesopotamian locations are named not only by where they are, but by what they do. A house can be a literal house, but also a category. A temple house, a house of a god, a house of records, a house of offerings, a house of water, a house of weaving. If the forbidden place is framed as a house in this institutional sense, the ban reads less like a cosmic interdiction and more like a restricted facility, a facility where something is stored, processed, or communicated. We also pay attention to the way sacred language often overlaps with technical language. Terms that look like holiness can be operational. Words translated as pure can refer to controlled conditions. Words translated as holy can imply restricted access or special handling. Words translated as secret can be a reminder that certain knowledge is limited to trained personnel, in a system that fears contamination. Secrecy and cleanliness can be linked, not because of drama, but because a contaminated offering, a contaminated implement, or a compromised seal can break the chain of legitimacy. If we treat the forbidden place as a controlled precinct, we can begin narrowing what it could be. The most likely candidate is not a lone room hidden behind a single door, but a zone with layers, an outer boundary where most people can approach, an intermediate boundary where only designated workers can enter, an inner boundary where only a narrow set of officials, often purified and authorized, can proceed. This is how many temple and palace complexes functioned. The architecture itself is a document. Corridors are sentences, doorways are clauses. The farther inward you go, the fewer categories of people remain. Now the prohibition begins to read like one line in a larger access hierarchy. Humans, in the sense of undifferentiated public entrance, are excluded because the place is reserved for a subset. Priests, administrators, or a designated staff who carry authority and cleanliness in the bureaucratic sense. The Anunnaki, in this reading, may not be physically present. Their role may be to certify the seriousness of the boundary. The boundary is not negotiable because it is framed as divine order. We explore a second possibility that stays grounded. The one place could be a point where information is concentrated, a record chamber, a tablet house, an archive. In that case, the forbidden place wouldn't be barred because it contains a mystical object, but because it contains the administrative memory of the institution. Ration lists, land allotments, contracts, obligations, debts, temple inventories, delivery schedules, in a world where seals are power. Controlling the archive is controlling reality. To bar general access to such a chamber is to protect the integrity of the system. Not everyone needs to see the ledgers. Not everyone can be allowed to touch the tablets. Clay can be altered. Seals can be forged. An archive must be guarded by policy. A third possibility emerges when we consider water. Many cities depended on canals, basins, and controlled intakes. A place associated with a canal gate. An intake structure, a reservoir, or a purification basin could be restricted for practical reasons. Water is life. Water is also vulnerability. If a canal gate is tampered with, fields dry or flood. If a basin is contaminated, ritual and health are both threatened. A prohibition against ordinary entry could function as a kind of protective measure over the city's most sensitive infrastructure. Again, the language of divinity can serve as the strongest lock, a lock that is psychological as much as physical. We do not settle on one answer tonight. We hold these possibilities like 3 keys, all cut from the same metal. Each key fits the same lock shape, a place with a threshold, a place with critical function, a place where uncontrolled entry creates risk. Then we notice another detail that helps sharpen the silhouette. Forbidden places are often paired with authorized alternatives. A text might indicate where offerings are left instead of being brought inward. It might list a receiving point, an outer table, a courtyard station, a portico. Such alternatives are the footprints of restriction. If the sacred or sensitive zone is barred, the institution provides a controlled interface. That interface becomes the point where the public meets the system without entering its core. This interface also explains why the prohibition is written. Rules are written when misunderstanding is costly, when the wrong person enters. The consequences are not only spiritual, they are procedural. A ritual must be redone. A seal must be re-verified. A delivery is invalid. A schedule collapses. The text's calm prohibition might be the residue of repeated incidents, a solution to a problem that kept happening. The quiet tightening of control. The forbidden place now feels less like a legend and more like a node in a network. It is a node with constrained access, surrounded by buffer zones and authorized substitutes. It is defined by determinatives that classify it, verbs that describe how it is interacted with, and an underlying logic that treats people as categories with permissions. We end with a simple picture held in the mind, a city at dawn, workers moving in predictable paths, a temple or palace rising at the center, courtyards where many can stand, doors where fewer can pass, and somewhere within, a place whose threshold is not meant for the UN-designated body, a place where a single line of wedges becomes a wall. A forbidden place is rarely protected by a single barrier. In the administrative world of early cities, protection is layered. It is built from gates, seals, lists, and the quiet authority of watchers who know the rules better than they know the faces of strangers. Tonight we step into that gate logic, because the easiest way to understand exclusion is to follow the mechanisms that perform it. We begin with the gate itself, not as a dramatic threshold, but as a workplace. A gatehouse is a point where the flow of bodies becomes legible. It is where movement is turned into record. It has a bench where a guard or clerk can sit. It has a post where messages are delivered. It has a place to hang a seal cord, to store a tablet, to keep a stylus from drying. The gate is not only wood and brick, it is procedure. In many administrative settings, the simplest access control is the list. Names, titles, affiliations. The list can be a ledger of who may enter, who delivered what, who was assigned to stand watch. A list also reveals absence. If a class of people never appears among those who pass inward, the silence becomes evidence. When a text indicates that humans are excluded, we can imagine an implied list that narrows the eligible entrance into categories that are not simply human, but authorized, priest, administrator, courier, inspector, temple worker, ritual specialist, perhaps a family member of a high official, perhaps a trained servant permitted to carry objects but not to look around. The gate protocol can be read in the verbs that often accompany it. To open and close is literal, but it is also symbolic of permission. To receive and hand over implies an exchange that happens at a boundary. To seal implies that a transition has been formalized, that the movement is now protected against dispute. To witness implies that someone's presence turns an action into an accepted fact. These verbs create a choreography. They turn entry into a controlled act. We pay attention to sealing practices because they are the closest thing this world has to a signature that cannot be denied. A seal is pressed into clay as a proof of identity and authorization. A seal can belong to an individual, but also to an office. When an office seal appears, the person becomes secondary. The institution is speaking. And when a sealing phrase is attached to a boundary action, it indicates that the boundary is not casual. It is enforced as part of governance. A forbidden place, in this frame, is less like a room with a warning sign and more like a jurisdiction with its own paperwork. There may be a formal handoff at its edge. Goods might be transferred without the deliverer entering. A messenger might place an item on a table, step back, and wait while an authorized receiver inspects it. The receiver may record the quantity, the condition, the expected purpose. The receiver may then seal a tablet that confirms the transfer. The deliverer leaves without crossing the inner line. The forbidden place remains protected without a confrontation. The boundary holds because the system is designed to make compliance easy and violation visible. We imagine the watchers as part of this design. A watcher is not necessarily a soldier. Often it is a staff member whose power is procedural. The watcher knows the approved categories and the right phrases. The watcher can ask for a seal impression. The watcher can refuse entry without raising a voice because refusal is the default. The watcher can call for a supervisor, and that call itself is a protocol. In a world where honor and status matter, a gate denial can be humiliating. That is why the boundary is framed with the highest authority available. It is not the watcher's personal judgment. It is the order of the gods as understood by the institution. This is where the Anunnaki language becomes important again, not as a supernatural presence at the door, but as the invoked legitimacy that makes the door meaningful. When a prohibition is framed as coming from a divine council, the institution is saying that the boundary is woven into cosmic order. Disobedience is not simply trespass. It is disorder. The gate becomes a place where metaphysics reinforces administration. We look next at how exclusions can be enforced through purity requirements. A person might technically be an authorized worker and still be barred if they have not completed washing. If they have handled certain materials, if they have crossed certain spaces, purity is not only moral, it is a logistical condition. It divides the staff into those who are in compliance and those who must pause outside until they are cleared. This creates a dynamic boundary that can shift hour by hour. A forbidden place can remain stable, while access to it fluctuates. Such purity procedures can be monitored by intermediaries: a wash attendant, a keeper of garments, a supervisor who verifies that the correct steps were followed. When a text uses a prohibition phrase aimed broadly at humans, it may be compressing this complexity into a simple rule for the public. The internal staff may have a longer set of permissions and restrictions, but the public-facing version is blunt. Do not enter. Stay outside the boundary. Deliver what you must deliver at the proper point, and do not cross. We consider the possibility that the forbidden place also has restricted sound and sight, not because of drama, but because observation can be disruptive. If the inner zone is where sacred objects are stored, the presence of unauthorized eyes can be treated as contamination. If the inner zone is where records are kept, unauthorized eyes can be treated as threat. In both cases, the solution is the same: limited access, controlled sightlines, curtains, screens, door angles that prevent direct view. Architecture and policy combine to keep the inner work quiet. Now we shift to a detail that adds a new dimension. Some prohibitions are time-based. A place may be open to a broader category on certain days and closed on others. A gate may be accessible during festivals, but restricted during preparations. A storehouse may be entered only when an inspector is present. If the prohibition line is written without time qualifiers, it implies a constant restriction. That is a stronger claim. It suggests that the place is not a venue for public ritual. It is a backstage zone, a continuous operation, something that must be protected at all times, not only during special moments. We imagine how a continuous restriction would shape daily life. Workers would learn to route around it. Deliveries would be scheduled to minimize cross-traffic. Conversations would stop at its edge. Even children would absorb the rule by watching adults. A forbidden place becomes a psychological landmark. People know where not to step. They do not need to understand why. The boundary becomes normal. We also consider enforcement through penalties, not necessarily violent, but economic. A worker who violates access rules can lose rations. A family can lose an assignment. A craftsperson can be barred from temple contracts. In a rationed economy, Exclusion from the institution is exclusion from survival. The gate is not only wood, it is dependency. That dependency makes the boundary strong. The forbidden place therefore emerges as a space protected by a cluster of tools, lists that define categories, seals that formalize transitions, watchers who implement procedures, purity systems that regulate bodies, architectural design that limits sight and movement, and economic leverage that discourages violation. The prohibition is not theatrical. It is integrated into how the city functions. We let one quiet image linger at the end. A hand holding a small clay ceiling, still damp, bearing an impression that represents an office rather than a person. The ceiling is placed on a tablet that confirms a transfer at a boundary. The tablet hardens. The seal impression remains, and the forbidden place stays untouched by the Iyun-designated foot, protected by the simplest and most enduring power of all, recorded permission. The way an institution reveals itself is through repetition. One tablet can be dismissed as odd. Two can be debated. A cluster becomes a pattern, and patterns are the closest thing ancient administration has to confession. Tonight, we widen our attention from a single witness to a scattered chorus, not as a list of sources, but as a sensation that the same hands learned the same formulas in different rooms across different cities. We imagine a long table laid out with fragments. Some are whole tablets with clean edges. Some are broken corners, little crescents of clay with only a few signs preserved. Some are thick and heavy, as if made to endure handling. Some are thin and fine, as if meant for quick notes. The surfaces vary. One is pale buff, another deep brown, another almost grey, depending on clay and firing. Yet certain features repeat. The same structured line breaks. The same way a scribe spaces a prohibition phrase, giving it room to be seen. The same little grouping of signs that implies an access rule. This is how a formula behaves. It migrates. It survives damage because enough of it remains recognizable, even in fragments. A prohibition can be identified even when a tablet is cracked, because the key signs sit together like a seal of language. We do not need every wedge to be present. We need the skeleton. We pay attention to where such formulas tend to appear. In administrative texts, prohibitions are not evenly distributed. They cluster around sensitive categories: storage, ritual handling, elite residence, archives, workshops connected to sacred production, and boundary points where goods shift from public to institutional ownership. If we see the exclusion formula in documents about deliveries, it suggests a restricted receiving point. If we see it in texts about personnel assignments, it suggests a controlled zone with staffing rules. If we see it in texts about equipment, it suggests protected implements, perhaps used in rituals or in record keeping. The pattern also becomes visible in the way some tablets name roles more than individuals. Instead of personal names, the text may emphasize offices, titles, functions: keeper of the gate, overseer of the storehouse, washer of the sacred vessels, recorder of the accounts. These roles are like gears in a machine. When such roles appear near exclusion language, the forbidden place begins to look like a machine room, a place where certain functions occur that must not be interrupted. Another repeating element is the logic of transfer. Many administrative documents care deeply about whether an object is in one set of hands or another. The text indicates receipt, responsibility, accountability. It establishes that if something goes missing later, the blame can be traced. A forbidden place, in this context, can be the point at which responsibility changes. The public world ends and the institutional world begins. The prohibition protects that transition. If the wrong person crosses the line, the chain of accountability becomes vulnerable. We imagine a scenario that fits this logic without sensationalism. A delivery of textiles arrives at a temple complex. The weaver or courier is not permitted inside the inner storehouse. The textiles are placed at an outer threshold. An authorized storehouse keeper inspects them, counts them, notes their quality, and records the total. A tablet is made. A seal is pressed. The courier leaves. The textiles are carried inward by designated staff. The courier never enters the forbidden place. The institution remains intact. The record becomes the bridge. When we see similar transfer logic across multiple documents, the forbidden place becomes less mysterious and more consistent. It is where the institution safeguards the conversion of objects into sacred or official property. The boundary is not only physical, it is conceptual. It marks when something becomes part of the god's estate, the palace's estate, the administrative memory. Such conversions require clean procedure. The prohibition phrase functions as an anti-contamination measure for the chain of custody. There is another pattern that often accompanies restrictions: duplication of record. Sometimes the same transaction is recorded in multiple copies, or a summary tablet is made after daily entries. When access is restricted, duplication becomes a safety feature. If one record is damaged or contested, another survives. If a forbidden place includes an archive, the institution may keep a copy inside and a copy outside, or a copy in a separate office. The presence of mirrored accounting implies concern for loss, tampering, or sudden disruption. This leads us into a new development. Repetition does not only indicate normal routine, it can indicate stress. Institutions repeat rules most aggressively when they fear failure. A place becomes forbidden in the strongest terms when the system has experienced leakage, intrusion, contamination, theft, or confusion. If we see the formula appearing more frequently in a period, it might suggest a tightening of controls, not a mythic decree, but a management response. The forbidden place becomes the center of anxiety. We look for stress indicators in administrative language: sudden emphasis on seals, sudden emphasis on verification, sudden mention of watchers, sudden references to emergency storage, temporary relocation, unusual counts, or items moved at odd hours. The more the documents lean toward control, the more we suspect instability. A forbidden place might be forbidden because it contains what must be protected during instability. The Anunnaki theme enters here in a subtler way. Invoking the highest divine authority in mundane documents can be a sign of heightened concern. It is like stamping a rule with the strongest possible imprint, not because the gods personally patrol the corridor, but because invoking them increases compliance. When fear rises, legitimacy becomes a tool. The institution wraps its procedures in divine sanction because divine sanction is harder to argue with than human instruction. We also consider the social effect of repeating exclusion language. Over time, such repetition shapes collective behavior. People internalize the boundary. They stop questioning it. The forbidden place becomes part of the city's mental map. It becomes a place spoken of with lowered voices, even if it is only a room of tablets or a storehouse of vessels. The effect is the same. Restriction generates aura. Aura then reinforces restriction. Now we take the fragments as a kind of statistical whisper, not numbers, but the sense that the formula appears in different hands, different clay, different contexts. This makes the prohibition feel institutional rather than personal. It is not the whim of one ruler or one priest. It is embedded in how the system trains its scribes. The forbidden place, whatever it is, belongs to the structure of governance. We let one more possibility surface, one that keeps the pattern lively. The forbidden place might not be fixed in one location. It could be a category of space that travels, a sealed chest of tablets, a portable shrine, a bundle of sacred objects moved between cities. In that case, the prohibition would follow the object rather than the building. The one place would be a mobile precinct, defined by what it contains. The same access rule would apply wherever the object resides. This would explain why the formula appears across regions. The restriction is attached to a practice, not a map coordinate. Whether the forbidden place is fixed or mobile, the repeating formula tells us one thing with calm clarity. The boundary is managed. It is enacted through standard language. It is reinforced through documentation. The forbidden place is not an accident. It is designed. We close with an image that feels almost weightless. A scribe finishing a line, lifting the stylus, and leaving a tiny space before the prohibition phrase, as if the clay itself needs a breath around those signs. The phrase is written once more, in a hand that has done it many times. The tablet dries. The rule becomes durable. The forbidden place remains, held in place by repetition. A second kind of evidence enters when we listen to the stories people told about themselves. Administrative records define boundaries with procedures. Literary tradition defines boundaries with meaning. The two do not always match. And the mismatch is where an investigation becomes interesting. Tonight we move into the epic-shaped imagination that later readers often reach for when they hear the name Anunnaki. We will treat it gently, but we will not let it dominate. We will read it as a cultural surface that sometimes covers a harder structure underneath. In narrative tradition, the divine world is often staged like a court. Councils gather, decisions are made. Humanity is assigned a role. A forbidden place becomes a symbol of separation between orders of being. The stories can feel like they are telling us that mortals are barred from a cosmic chamber where gods keep their deepest designs. This is the familiar mood. It is easy to picture and easy to repeat. But when we lay this mood beside institutional practice, something changes. The epic tone tends to dramatize what the city's machinery accomplishes quietly. A council of gods can be a metaphoric reflection of actual councils of officials. A divine decree can mirror a human administrative decision that is given a sacred frame. A forbidden place described as unapproachable can be the narrative shadow of a precinct that was practically restricted. We observe the pattern of how stories handle space. Epics often describe temples, gates, and inner rooms in heightened language. They name thresholds. They speak of radiance and awe. They speak of fear and purity. They speak of words that cannot be heard by the unprepared. These motifs are not invented from nothing. They are shaped by lived experience of restricted spaces, and then amplified into myth. A person who grew up knowing there were doorways they could not cross would find it natural to imagine that the gods too have inner rooms where access is denied. So we learn to see the epic tradition as a translation of procedure into feeling. It turns gate protocol into cosmic law. It turns sealing into fate. It turns access hierarchy into ontological separation. This does not make the stories false. It makes them interpretive. They are how a society tells itself why the boundary exists. Now we sharpen our method by separating conventional narrative from evidence. The conventional narrative says that the Anunnaki forbade humanity from entering a single place because it was inherently divine, inherently dangerous, inherently beyond mortal comprehension. It suggests the ban is absolute and metaphysical, but that requires ignoring three practical contradictions that appear when we compare story logic with institutional logic. First, metaphysical bans do not require constant maintenance. If a place is truly unreachable by nature, no gatekeepers are needed, no lists are needed, no sealing phrases are needed. The presence of administrative restriction implies that entry is physically possible, socially tempting, and therefore must be managed. Second, cosmic bans do not usually include transfer procedures. They do not need receiving points, handoffs, verified counts, or designated intermediaries. Yet restricted spaces in real complexes often function precisely through controlled transfer. The very existence of documentation around boundaries suggests that the forbidden place is a working node that interacts with the surrounding world in regulated ways. Third, absolute metaphysical separation wouldn't generate repeated formulaic prohibitions across routine texts. It would appear in hymns, prayers, and moral teachings. Formulaic bans embedded in practical records suggest institutional standardization, the kind that arises when many people must be trained to behave consistently. These contradictions do not eliminate the epic tradition. They simply reposition it. We can treat the epics and myths as the society's storytelling wrapper around its operational core. With that repositioning, a more careful hypothesis becomes possible. What if the one place was a specific controlled zone within an urban sacred economy, and the Anunnaki were invoked as the ultimate legitimizing authority for excluding the general public from that zone? The mythic language would then be a high-level explanation of a low-level rule. The rule would feel sacred because the institution needed it to feel sacred. We explore how this would work psychologically. A boundary enforced purely by guards invites conflict. A boundary framed as divine order invites compliance. If the public believes that crossing the threshold risks cosmic disorder, fewer people will test it. The institution avoids constant policing. The boundary becomes self-enforcing. Stories spread and do the work that walls cannot. This helps explain why narratives often emphasize consequences for trespass. Not necessarily physical harm, but impurity, misfortune, disorder, or a disruption of proper fate. These narrative consequences mirror real institutional consequences like loss of status, loss of rations, or public shame. The myth translates administrative penalty into existential penalty. It scales the cost in imagination, so the cost in reality is never incurred. We consider another layer. Stories are not only tools for control, they are also memory. They can preserve the impression of something that changed. If a restricted space became more closed over time, or if access rules tightened due to crisis, the memory of that tightening could be preserved as a mythic moment. People might speak as if the gods suddenly forbade entry, when in reality a council of officials revised procedures. The narrative compresses gradual policy into a single decisive scene, because stories prefer clear turning points. This leads to a new development in our understanding. The epic tradition can contain traces of administrative change when a story describes a sealed chamber, a hidden tablet of destinies, a sacred object guarded from mortals. It may be echoing real practices of record control. When a story speaks of a divine assembly where decrees are fixed, it may be echoing the role of archives and sealed decisions in governance. The place might be where decisions were stored, where records were held, where accountability was anchored. The mythic image of a cosmic registry could be the imaginative reflection of a very real registry. We also notice how narratives love the idea of a single forbidden locus, because a single locus is easier to remember than a system. A city's access hierarchy is complex. A story simplifies it into one door, one chamber, one threshold that matters most. The one place in storytelling can be a compressed symbol for an entire network of restricted spaces. But the administrative evidence suggests there was often one core node within that network, a center of gravity, where restriction was most intense. The story takes that core node and wraps it in cosmic language. We do not quote ancient lines directly. Instead, we hold the shape of them: a council, a decree, a boundary, a warning, a reverent distance. These shapes align with procedure in a way that feels almost inevitable. Tonight, the main shift is subtle but important. We stop treating the literary tradition as a separate universe from administration. We treat it as the human emotional interpretation of the same architecture of control. The Anunnaki in stories are the face of legitimacy. The forbidden place in stories is the symbol of restricted access. The institution, meanwhile, keeps the boundary real with lists, seals, watchers, and routine. We end with the thought that myth is not the opposite of bureaucracy. In these cities, myth is what bureaucracy sounds like when it is heard from the outside of the gate. The forbidden place remains forbidden, not because it is unreachable, but because the society has learned to make the boundary feel older than any person, heavier than any argument, and as unquestionable as the order of the gods. A place becomes most visible when we walk it in the mind, as if our feet know the dust. Tonight we choose one anchor landscape and let its sacred geometry guide our attention, not because it provides certainty, but because it provides a workable scale. A city with deep ritual history, long habitation, and a temple complex that could hold both devotion and administration. We will call it an anchor site in the southern alluvium, a place often associated with beginnings, where water and mud make architecture possible, and where the idea of an original sanctuary clings to the ground like salt. We enter this landscape through its topography, low mounds rising from flat earth, channels that once carried water and now carry silence. The wind moves fine grit across broken brick. A temple precinct would have stood here, not as a single building, but as a layered organism. Early phases might be simple platforms and small rooms. Later phases expand into courtyards, multiple chambers, storage areas, workshops, and formal gateways. Every expansion is also a refinement of access. As complexes grow, their inner functions become more protected, not by a dramatic act, but by design. We focus on circulation. In many temple compounds, there is a path for the public and a path for staff. The public path leads into an outer courtyard, where offerings may be presented. The staff path moves through service corridors, storage zones, and inner chambers. These paths are not always marked by inscriptions. They are marked by thresholds that narrow, by turns that reduce sight lines, by doors that require keys and authority. The architecture itself performs the prohibition. Now we add a specific administrative layer. A temple in an early city is not only a place of prayer, it is a distribution center. It receives goods, manages labor, issues rations, stores tools, maintains herds, oversees fields. The temple is an employer and a landlord. Its inner chambers can function as storage and as symbolic heart. The more valuable the goods and the more sensitive the records, the more reason to restrict access. The forbidden place in such a complex is likely not the public courtyard and not the main processional hall. Those spaces exist to be seen. The forbidden place is more likely a room behind the visible ritual space, a node where sacred objects are kept, where offerings are transformed into stored wealth, where records are curated, where decisions are sealed. This would be the place where the institution protects continuity. We walk inward in imagination. The outer courtyard is open air. The ground is packed and swept. People can gather. Priests can move among them. A receiving table or offering platform stands where hands can place goods and step back. Beyond that is a doorway. The doorway is narrower than the courtyard suggests it should be. The threshold stone is worn. The plaster near the jamb is smoother from touch. This is where permission begins. Past the doorway, the air changes. It is cooler, quieter. Sound doesn't travel as freely. The corridor turns, and the turn is important. A direct line from public space to inner chamber is avoided. The turn is a simple security feature. It prevents the casual gaze. It forces the body to slow and adjust. It makes the act of entry deliberate. We imagine the inner spaces in functional terms. A room with shelves, where jars and baskets can be stacked. A room with a low platform where seals and tablets might be kept. A room with a basin for washing hands and tools. A room where garments reserved for service are stored. A room where a small group can meet and confirm accounts. Each room has a role. The forbidden place may be one of these, or a cluster of them treated as a single restricted zone. We bring in the idea of layers, not only architectural, but temporal. Over centuries, rules can tighten. A doorway that was once wide becomes rebuilt narrower. A courtyard that once connected directly to an inner chamber becomes separated by a vestibule. A service corridor becomes more enclosed. These changes can be read as responses to practical pressures. increased wealth, increased complexity, increased risk. The physical structure becomes more protective as the institution grows more central. This is where the Anunnaki theme can be understood in a grounded way. A temple is often described as the house of a god, but also as a place where divine order is enacted. If a restricted inner zone is framed as belonging to a divine assembly, the exclusion of ordinary humans becomes natural in the institution's worldview. It is not that humans are despised. It is that the inner work requires a special state and special authorization. The Anunnaki, as a council concept, can function like a theological model of administrative hierarchy. A divine council mirrors the human council. Both require controlled entry. We consider how staff might be organized in such a complex. There are categories of laborers who work outside, carrying water, hauling bricks, tending animals, cleaning courtyards. There are craft specialists who produce textiles, carve wood, shape metal. There are ritual specialists who handle offerings and sacred objects. There are administrators who manage accounts and seals. Not all staff are equal in access. The inner restricted zone is likely reserved for those whose roles involve direct handling of sacred wealth or its records. In this frame, humanity in the prohibition line can mean the general population and also the lower tiers of staff. The ban is not necessarily against all people. It is against the UN designated. The institution draws a line not between humans and gods, but between permitted and not permitted. It is a human boundary justified by divine language. We introduce another new element that fits an anchor site: foundational rites and renewal rites. Temples are rebuilt. Offerings are placed in foundation deposits. Objects can be buried under corners, under thresholds, under platforms. These deposits are often meant to remain untouched. A place associated with foundations can become taboo, not because it is a cosmic portal, but because disturbing it threatens the temple's legitimacy and stability. If the forbidden place is tied to such deposits, the prohibition becomes an anti-disturbance protocol. The threshold itself becomes sacred and restricted because it holds the institution's memory in clay and stone beneath it. We also consider the role of water in an anchor landscape, shaped by canals and marsh. Water rituals, purification basins, and controlled intakes could be embedded within the precinct. A restricted water point, if it supplies a purification basin or a ritual channel, would require protection. If ordinary entry could contaminate it, the entire ritual system would be compromised. The forbidden place might be where water is managed and sanctified, a functional installation wrapped in sacred meaning. Tonight, the anchor landscape offers a clear conclusion without claiming certainty. The forbidden place is most plausibly an inner node of a temple economic complex, protected through architecture, staffing hierarchy, purity control, and theological legitimacy. It is a place that must remain stable, because the city's continuity depends on it in ways people may not fully articulate. We end in a quiet inner corridor, where brick walls hold the day's heat and release it slowly into the dark. A door stands closed. No monster waits behind it. Only procedure, only records, only objects handled with care. The forbidden place feels less like a mythic abyss and more like the calm center of an institution that cannot afford to be interrupted. Restriction is not always about secrecy. Sometimes it is about conditions. A city can tolerate many kinds of difference, but it cannot tolerate uncontrolled contamination in the spaces where legitimacy is manufactured. Tonight we follow a vocabulary that often hides in plain sight, words that translators render as pure, clean, holy, bright, or set apart. These words can sound like theology, but they often function like maintenance. They describe states that must be preserved, and they imply that certain bodies, objects, and actions can disrupt those states. We imagine an attendant at a basin within a precinct, not at the public edge, but in a service zone. The attendant monitors water levels, replaces cloths, checks vessels, watches hands. The work is repetitive. It is also serious, because the system treats impurity as more than dirt. Impurity is a category that can invalidate a procedure. A ritual can fail. An offering can be rejected. A seal can be compromised. A record can be considered unreliable if handled by the wrong person at the wrong time. Purity language functions as a filter. It defines who can cross a threshold and when. It can also define what can cross. A jar might be allowed inward only if covered and marked. A textile might be allowed inward only if new or properly laundered. A tool might be allowed inward only if stored in a designated place and handled by designated hands. When these requirements are strict, the easiest way to preserve them is to restrict entry. Excluding the general category of people is simpler than trying to police every possible source of contamination. This is where the forbidden place becomes a kind of controlled environment, not sterile in the modern sense, but regulated. The institution is trying to keep a set of variables stable: air, dust, moisture, touch, sound, gaze, intention. Even if the system describes these variables in spiritual terms, the effect is practical. It reduces unpredictability. We consider how such control would appear in documentation. A text might indicate that a person is cleansed. A text might record that a garment is prepared. A text might list the distribution of oil or soap like substances used for washing. A text might specify that an object is handled in a particular sequence. These details, when present, show that purity is operational. It is not merely symbolic. It is a set of steps. Then we reach a key insight that changes the feeling of the forbidden place. Contamination is not only physical, it is also social and informational. A restricted chamber can be pure because it is free of unauthorized influence. If an archive is treated as pure, it means its contents must remain unaltered and uncontested. If a decision chamber is treated as pure, it means the decision must not be polluted by outside pressure. If a sacred storage room is treated as pure, it means the goods must remain intact, unstolen, and properly accounted for. Purity, in this sense, becomes a metaphor for integrity. Integrity of objects, integrity of records, integrity of authority. The forbidden place is protected because it concentrates integrity. We explore how the system might fear pollution in the form of speech. Gossip can be contamination. Rumor can be contamination. A public audience can be contamination. If a restricted process requires quiet concentration, then the presence of outsiders becomes disruptive. The institution may therefore restrict not only entry, but also knowledge of what happens inside. The forbidden place becomes a zone of controlled narrative. Only the authorized can describe it. And even they may describe it with careful restraint. In such a system, a phrase that forbids entry to humans is not a condemnation of humanity. It is a protective shorthand. It means keep the general public, with its unpredictable bodies and unpredictable talk, away from the procedures that must remain stable. It is the same logic that would keep certain workshops closed to visitors. Not because the work is magical, but because the work requires consistency. We introduce a new element that often accompanies purity systems, the management of liminal objects. Objects that pass between outside and inside must be handled in special ways. Offerings brought from households may be considered mixed with ordinary life. Before they can enter the inner zone, they may need to be transformed, washed, rewrapped, re-tagged, recounted. The transformation is not only ritual, it is a reclassification. It changes the object's status from personal to institutional, from profane to sacred, from private to public property of a divine estate. The forbidden place might be precisely where this reclassification becomes final. The boundary is where an object's identity changes. If ordinary people were allowed into that zone, they could witness the transformation, and witnessing could invite questions. Questions can destabilize authority. So the restriction protects not only the object, but the concept of transformation itself. It keeps the institution's methods from becoming too visible. We also consider how purity systems treat the body as a carrier of history. Where a person has been matters. Who they have touched matters. What they have eaten matters. In an economy with animals, fields, and canals, bodies are constantly exposed to mud, blood from slaughter, waste, decay. The public world is lively and messy. The inner precinct cannot afford that mess. The easiest boundary is categorical. Most bodies are excluded. A few are trained and monitored. This produces a social stratification that feels theological. Those who enter are not only workers, they are a distinct class, marked by dress, by schedules, by rituals, by knowledge. Their access makes them special. The public sees that and interprets it as closeness to divine power. The institution benefits from that interpretation. It doesn't have to explain that the access is also about inventory control and contamination risk. It can let the aura do the work. Now we shift to the sign logic again, but in a way that deepens rather than repeats. Purity terms often attach to spaces and objects as labels, almost like tags. A room can be designated as pure. A vessel can be designated as pure. A pathway can be designated as pure. Once designated, the label creates rules. It requires maintenance. It requires plussing. It requires periodic renewal. If the label is attached to the forbidden place, then the forbidden place is not only restricted, it is maintained as a state. A maintained state can fail. That possibility matters. If purity can be lost, then it must be actively protected. The existence of a prohibition suggests that the system knows the state can be compromised. The forbidden place is thus a fragile center, not an invincible fortress. The institution's anxiety is not melodramatic. It is realistic. One mistake can ripple outward. We end with an image of quiet labor. An authorized worker pauses at a threshold, washes hands in cool water, dries them with a cloth reserved for that purpose, adjusts a garment that signals eligibility, and steps into a corridor that smells faintly of clay and oil. The door closes. The world outside continues. The forbidden place remains in its maintained condition, protected not by violence, but by a vocabulary that turns cleanliness into policy and policy into sacred order. When institutions feel stable, their records sound calm. When institutions feel threatened, their records begin to tighten. The language becomes more careful. Movement becomes more regulated. Inventories become more frequent. Tonight we enter a register of behavior that is not exactly panic, but something quieter and more disciplined, managed withdrawal. Not a dramatic evacuation in the cinematic sense, but a controlled response to pressure, executed through procedures that try to preserve continuity, even as conditions deteriorate. We begin with the concept of relocation, which in administrative worlds is rarely described as flight. It is described as transfer. Items are moved from one custody to another. Tablets are copied. Seals are reassigned. Keys change hands. Storehouse contents are counted and recounted. If there is a forbidden place at the center of the system, the protection around it may intensify during such periods. The restriction is not relaxed in crisis. It is strengthened because the core must survive. We imagine a set of actions that would accompany a managed withdrawal from a temple or palace precinct. The most valuable items are not necessarily gold. They can be tablets that establish land rights, seal stones that authorize transactions, lists of personnel obligations, records of offerings owed. These are the levers of power. If an institution must reduce its visible presence or temporarily abandon a site, these levers must be preserved. They are portable power. This is where the forbidden place may reveal its true role. If it houses the institution's memory and authorization tools, then, in a period of stress, it becomes the staging point for continuity. Only a narrow set of trusted personnel would be allowed near it. Access would be restricted not only for purity, but for security. The prohibition aimed at ordinary humans becomes more than a ritual rule. It becomes a protective barrier against desperation. In crisis, people try doors they would not normally try. We consider how such a scenario would feel in daily routine. The public courtyards might still be swept, but fewer offerings arrive. The staff still performs basic rituals, but with shorter processions. The gatekeepers check seals more carefully. More transactions are done at the boundary rather than inside. The inner zone grows quieter. People sense something without being told. A place that is already restricted becomes almost sealed. In documentation, managed withdrawal can appear as unusual inventory behavior, sudden full counts of storehouse contents, reassignment of custodianship, notes indicating temporary storage, movement of goods to a secondary location, consolidation of items, the creation of summary tablets that compress many entries into one, as if the institution wants a portable record that can travel. None of this needs dramatic language. The change is visible in what is measured and how often it is measured. We introduce a new category of evidence, sealing intensification. When an institution feels pressure, it often increases the number of seals required for an action. One seal becomes 2. An office seal is paired with a witness seal. A transfer is confirmed by multiple parties. This creates redundancy and reduces internal dispute. It also signals distrust, not necessarily personal distrust, but systemic recognition that conditions are unstable. In such conditions, the forbidden place can be treated as the last secure room, a chamber where seals are stored, where tablets are kept, where decisions are confirmed. If ordinary humans are forbidden to enter, it is because the institution cannot risk unverified presence. The boundary becomes a security perimeter. The Anunnaki, invoked as the highest authority, can function as the final seal on this perimeter. The institution is saying the boundary is protected by cosmic legitimacy. Even if the guards are tired, even if the city is restless, the rule stands. We also consider how managed withdrawal is tied to controlled silence. Institutions may reduce communication about their core operations. They may announce festivals while quietly moving records. They may continue public rituals to maintain confidence while internal staff executes preservation tasks. The forbidden place thus becomes not only physically restricted, but narratively restricted. People are given less information. Information becomes a resource that is rationed. This creates a distinctive tension. The public sees signs of continuity, but senses tightening boundaries. The restricted zone remains inaccessible, and that inaccessibility becomes meaningful. Rumors grow. Some people imagine divine anger. Some imagine hidden treasures. The institution, meanwhile, continues to operate through procedure, trying to avoid triggering panic. The forbidden place is protected, partly because it holds the tools needed to keep the story of continuity alive. We explore a practical detail that often appears in managed preservation: copying. Clay tablets can be recopied. A scribe can create duplicates of key records. In crisis, duplication is insurance. If one archive is lost, another survives. Copying is also a form of selection. Not everything is recopied, only what is considered essential. This selection tells us what the institution values most. If the forbidden place is associated with copied records, then the forbidden place is likely an archive or record chamber, or a space where copying is supervised. Copying also requires restricted access. A scribe must work with originals, which are sensitive. Allowing ordinary entrance into the copying space increases risk of damage or theft. So, the prohibition becomes part of the continuity plan. Only authorized personnel can approach the originals. The rest remain outside. We add another element: key objects that are difficult to replace. Seal stones carved with unique designs. Ritual implements with specific legitimacy. Items used in oath-taking. These objects can be small and portable. They can be hidden. They can be carried in cloth bundles. During managed withdrawal, such objects would be prioritized, and the room where they are kept would be restricted with extreme care. The forbidden place could be that room, a place of compact authority. Now we take a softer step into interpretation without certainty. If the one place is consistently framed as off-limits to ordinary humans, and if we see signs that institutions sometimes operated under stress, then the restriction may be linked to crisis management. The forbidden place is not only a sanctum, it is a vault. Not necessarily filled with wealth in the modern sense, but filled with the things that keep a system functioning: seals, records, authorized objects, the means of continuity. We end with a quiet scene that is procedural rather than dramatic. Night in a precinct. A small group of authorized staff in lamplight. A tablet is read, then placed into a container. A seal impression is made. A cord is tied. A list is checked. A bundle is carried out through a service corridor. The public gates remain closed. The forbidden place remains guarded by routine, even as the world outside shifts. The institution does not announce retreat. It simply moves its heart, carefully, in the language of transfer. A forbidden place becomes clearer when we stop thinking of it as a room and start thinking of it as a node. A node is a point where flows converge, where materials, people, and decisions intersect, and where small disruptions can ripple outward. Tonight we take the idea of the one place and reframe it as a strategic junction inside an early city system, not the most glamorous location, not the most visible, but the one that quietly governs the rest, because everything important must pass through it in some form. We begin with the flows. There is the flow of goods, grain, textiles, oil, metals, livestock products, tools, vessels. There is the flow of labor, who works where, who receives rations, who is assigned to haul, weave, polish, wash, record. There is the flow of information, lists, agreements, tallies, decisions, confirmations, disputes. There is the flow of legitimacy, seals, oaths, witness presence, official titles invoked to make an action binding. A node is where these flows are transformed into each other. Goods become rations through record. Labor becomes obligation through record. Information becomes authority through seal. If we imagine such a node in physical space, it could be an archive chamber. It could be a sealing room. It could be a counting room attached to a storehouse. It could be an inner office within a temple or palace. The key feature is not furniture. The key feature is function. It is where transactions become official. That function explains why an institution might forbid general entry. A node is vulnerable because it concentrates power. If unauthorized people enter, they can observe procedures, influence decisions, steal small objects with massive leverage, or simply disrupt the calm required for accurate accounting. Even minor interference can create confusion that later becomes conflict. In a world without digital backups, the integrity of a few tablets can determine who owns a field. The integrity of a seal impression can determine whether a shipment is legitimate. The node is therefore protected because it is the point of conversion between reality and record. We explore what this conversion looks like in practice. A delivery arrives. The goods are counted. A tablet is inscribed. A seal is pressed. The tablet now becomes the official memory of the delivery. Without the tablet, the delivery can be denied. With the tablet, the delivery becomes binding. The forbidden place could be where this tablet is made and sealed. It would not need to be large. It would need to be controlled. Now we add a new angle, the node as a place of consensus. Many administrative decisions require agreement among parties. A storehouse keeper agrees they received goods. A supervisor agrees the count is correct. A witness agrees the procedure occurred. A higher official agrees the transaction is acceptable. These agreements are often implied by seals and titles. If the node is where these agreements are formalized, then it is also where conflict can be prevented. Keeping it restricted keeps negotiations orderly. It reduces the chance that outsiders pressure an official or attempt to insert themselves as witnesses. We consider how the Anunnaki concept fits a node model. A divine council is, in narrative terms, a place where decisions are made and fixed. If an institution invokes the Anunnaki as the highest legitimizing body, it is effectively saying that the node is aligned with cosmic governance. The decisions made or recorded here are not merely human preference. They participate in order. This reinforces compliance in the broader city. People accept outcomes because they are framed as legitimate beyond dispute. This does not require belief in a literal divine meeting in the room. It only requires recognition that sacred language can stabilize decisions. A node that produces binding records benefits from sacred framing, because sacred framing discourages challenges. When disputes are expensive, legitimacy is protection. We then consider the node as a place that manages exceptions. Routine is easy. Exception is where systems break. A failed harvest, a missing delivery, a worker injured, a shortage of oil, a damaged seal, a suspected theft. Exceptions require decisions that deviate from the usual path. Those decisions must be documented carefully. They require trusted personnel. They often require secrecy, not because the truth is mystical, but because public knowledge of scarcity can cause unrest. The forbidden place, as a node, could be where exceptions are processed. This introduces a fresh and unsettling possibility that remains grounded. The forbidden place might be where the institution handles discrepancy, where it reconciles numbers, where it decides how to cover gaps, where it allocates loss. In any economy, discrepancies arise. In a temple economy, discrepancies can threaten the perception of divine order. A shortage in offerings can be interpreted as divine displeasure. The institution may therefore manage discrepancies quietly, adjusting accounts, reassigning resources, and maintaining outward continuity. Such work would be sensitive. It would require restricted entry, not because it is evil, but because it is delicate. We explore what architectural features might support a node, a room near a storehouse, but not inside it. A room with benches for scribes, a place to store seal stones, a container for fresh clay, a shelf for finished tablets to dry, a small basin for washing hands, a doorway positioned to control who can enter, perhaps even a secondary exit for trusted staff, allowing movement without passing through public corridors. These features are subtle and practical. They do not announce themselves to the casual visitor. They simply make the work possible. We consider the sensory environment of such a node, the smell of wet clay, the faint oil scent from lamps, the scratch of stylus on clay, a soft pressure sound rather than a scrape, the muted voices of officials, the occasional firm press of a seal. The atmosphere would feel focused, not ornate. The power here is not in decoration, it is in procedure. The forbidden place, reimagined as a node, also explains why it could be described as a single place, even if the institution is complex. A system can have many restricted zones, but it often has one core conversion point where records and authority converge most intensely. That core becomes the symbolic center of restriction. People speak of it as the place you cannot enter, not because every inner room is forbidden, but because this one room embodies the boundary between ordinary life and institutional reality. We add another new development. Nodes tend to produce standardized language. If many transactions pass through the same room, scribes develop formulas. They repeat phrases. They create templates. Over time, the formulas become tradition. The prohibition phrase could be one of these templates, inserted to remind staff and outsiders that the node is protected. The formula becomes part of the room's identity. We end with a quiet recognition. A forbidden place does not need to contain a secret artifact from the sky. It can contain something more powerful in a city that lives by record, the means to decide what counts as true. A small room where clay is shaped into memory, where seals turn actions into binding facts, where the institution's version of the world is fixed and protected. Ordinary humans are barred because ordinary entry would make truth negotiable. And in a fragile city, negotiable truth is a risk the system cannot afford. The last evidence often looks small, not a new building, not a new narrative, not a dramatic discovery, but a final procedural touch that tells us how an institution wanted a boundary to be remembered. Tonight we end with the language of closure, the seal, the cord, the final impression, the finished tablet set aside to harden in administrative worlds. Closure is the moment when a decision stops being fluid and becomes fixed. If the one place was protected, it was protected most effectively at the moment of closure, when the record becomes the log. We imagine a clay tablet near completion. The scribe has filled most of the surface. The final line is placed carefully, because endings are where disputes begin. The scribe leaves enough space for a sealing phrase or a confirmation note. Then the seal is pressed. The impression might show a figure, a symbol, a name, an emblem of office. The seal impression is not decoration. It is an assertion that the content is now under authority. A final seal does more than confirm a transaction. It creates a boundary in time. It says the moment has passed. It says the count is complete. It says responsibility has transferred. It says the archive now holds the official version. This is why seals are so often tied to restricted spaces. A seal must be protected to protect the system's reality. We consider how a closing formula might include a restriction. A tablet can end with a note that certain people must not see it, must not handle it, must not enter the place where it is stored. Such a note is the verbal equivalent of a locked door. It is also a psychological guard. A person holding the tablet is reminded that they are in contact with authority. If they ignore the instruction, they aren't merely disobedient. They are violating the chain of legitimacy. The forbidden place, in this closing frame, is the room where sealed items are finalized and stored. It is the place where the institution's decisions are deposited into clay and then protected from alteration. The act of sealing is an act of making reality durable. The act of restricting entry is an act of preserving that durability. We introduce a new detail that deepens the mood. The physical handling of drying tablets. Freshly inscribed clay is vulnerable. A careless touch can smear signs. A drop can crack the surface. A tablet might need to dry in a specific area, perhaps on shelves, perhaps near gentle heat, perhaps away from moisture. If the institution produces many tablets, the drying area becomes a sensitive zone. Not everyone can be allowed near it. A forbidden place could therefore be partly defined by practical vulnerability. The writing must remain unsmudged. The seal impression must remain crisp. The record must remain readable. This practical need can blend with sacred framing. A drying room can become a pure room because it must remain untouched. Over time, the staff treat it with reverence because their work depends on its integrity. Outsiders see the reverence and assume the room contains mysteries. In reality, it contains the fragile moment when memory is becoming permanent. We also consider how closure is related to storage and retrieval. An archive does not only store, it must retrieve. Retrieval requires organization. Tablets are grouped by year, by category, by office, by location, by type of transaction. Some may be wrapped, some may be stored in jars, some may be placed in baskets. Labels can be attached. Clay tags can identify bundles. The forbidden place could be a storage chamber with such organization. A room where the institution's categories are physically arranged. Restricting access to that room protects more than secrecy. It protects order. If unauthorized hands disturb the arrangement, the archive becomes useless. In a system that depends on retrieving a tablet to settle a dispute, losing a tablet is like losing a court judgment. The archive must be stable. The simplest way to keep it stable is to keep most people out. Now we bring the Anunnaki concept into its final functional role. In a worldview where divine order and administrative order overlap, the ultimate authority is invoked at the point where records become binding. The Anunnaki as a council concept can serve as the imagined guarantor that seals are valid and that boundaries are real. This does not require literal presence. It requires shared belief that the institution's closure procedures are aligned with cosmic legitimacy. This belief makes the archive feel like more than a room. It makes it feel like a node where divine and civic order meet. We shift to a different kind of question, one that lingers. If a place is forbidden, it implies a difference in status between those who can enter and those who cannot. That difference has consequences for social memory. Those who enter carry knowledge that others do not. They know how decisions are fixed. They know how shortages are managed. They know how records can be interpreted. They know the quiet details of how authority is built. The forbidden place, therefore, creates two realities in the same city: the public reality of ritual and story, and the inner reality of procedure and record. The unsettling part is not supernatural. It is human. A system that controls access to its core also controls how truth is manufactured. People outside the door may never know what is stored, what is decided, what is copied, what is omitted. They will know only the outcomes. They will feel that the outcomes descend from higher powers. The institution benefits from that feeling because it prevents constant challenge. And yet, we end with restraint. We do not claim that every restricted archive hid deception. We do not claim that the forbidden place was a sinister chamber. We keep the tone careful. A restricted node can exist because a society needs stability. A fragile economy needs records. A sacred institution needs continuity. Restriction can be a form of protection, even if it also concentrates power. We end with one final image of closure. A sealed tablet is placed on a shelf. The clay cools and hardens. The impression holds. The signs become permanent. The door to the storage chamber closes with a soft sound, more like a decision than a noise. The forbidden place remains quiet, not because it is empty, but because it is full of fixed moments, each one a small lock on the past. We let the pace slow now. The investigation does not need to keep moving. The mind can set down its tools the way a scribe sets down a stylus when the clay is finished. In the quiet of this imagined precinct, the forbidden place is no longer a dramatic secret. It is a calm center of procedure, a room where boundaries are maintained, where records are protected, where legitimacy is preserved through careful habits. The atmosphere is still, like air that has learned to hold its breath. If you are listening from somewhere dark tonight, you can let the details soften. The shelves, the seals, the corridors can fade into simpler shapes. What remains is the feeling of a threshold, the understanding that ancient power often lived in paperwork, in access rules, in the careful control of who could step where. The Anunnaki, as a name invoked for authority, becomes part of that same system, a way of making the boundary feel older than any argument and stronger than any curiosity. We can imagine leaving the precinct without hurry. The outer courtyard opens to the night sky. The ground is cool underfoot. Farther out, the city's ordinary life continues, with water carried in jars, with voices in low conversation, with lamps dimming one by one. The forbidden place stays behind closed doors, doing what it always did, holding the fragile points where decisions become durable. There is nothing for us to force open. The calmest conclusion is that restriction itself was the message. A boundary written into clay, repeated in formulas, reinforced by seals and routine, tells us what the institution valued most: continuity. And continuity, in early cities, depended on keeping certain nodes protected, not by spectacle, but by procedure. Now the last images can dissolve. The corridor becomes shadow. The door becomes a simple line. The tablet becomes a small, warm weight that we do not need to carry any more. We can let it rest in its drawer, in its box, in its quiet, catalogued place. End of script. Good night.